The fence was in the wrong place. Louise Leland knew it the moment she rode up to the line of fresh cedar posts and new wire, strung tight and gleaming in the early October sun of 1883, cutting straight across what she had always known to be the southeastern corner of her property. She pulled her sorrel mare to a stop and stared at the wire with the kind of fury that starts behind the eyes and travels slowly, deliberately, through the whole body like a fever finding its way to the blood. She had ridden 7 miles that morning. 7 miles from the Leland homestead, which was no longer a homestead in any thriving sense of the word, past the dry creek bed and the ruined kitchen garden and the grave marker she tried not to look at directly, to arrive here at this fence and discover that Calvin Rourke had done exactly what she feared he would do. He had moved it overnight. The hearing before Judge Alderman in Harlow Creek was scheduled for this Thursday, 4 days from now. She had filed the petition herself, 6 weeks ago, in her late husband's name because the land was still legally listed under the estate of Thomas Leland, deceased 18 months and 3 days. She had carried that petition into town on a day when the temperature was over 100 degrees, and the road was nothing but cracked yellow clay, and she had stood at the county recorder's desk and laid it down with both hands and said, quietly and clearly, that she intended to contest the property line between the Leland parcel and the Rourke ranch, because she believed that Calvin Rourke had been incrementally stealing land from her dead husband's estate. And now the fence had moved again. Not outward this time, in the direction away from her property. The fence had moved inward, onto what had previously been Rourke land, ceding back a strip of ground that was wider than she'd expected, wider even than the disputed corridor she had documented in her petition. The cedar posts were pale and freshly split, the wire still bright without a trace of rust, the earth around the base of each post dark and disturbed where it had been dug just within the last day or two. She sat very still on her horse. This was not what she had prepared herself for. She had prepared herself for outrage, for confrontation, for the satisfaction of pointing at evidence and making her case before a judge. She had prepared herself for Calvin Rourke to stand in a courtroom and lie to her face the way powerful men in this territory had been lying to women like her since before she arrived here. She had prepared herself for loss, even. She had lived with loss long enough to know its texture, its weight, the particular way it settled in the chest at the end of the day. She had not prepared herself for the fence to already be moved. She had not prepared herself for the possibility that he had simply done the right thing. She dismounted slowly, looping her mare's reins around one of the new posts, and she walked the line of the fence for 100 yards in each direction, checking it against the survey markers she had memorized, the descriptions she had copied out of county records by lamplight while her 8-year-old daughter, Nora, slept in the next room. The line was correct, more than correct. There was an extra 3 feet on her side in places, a clear and unambiguous acknowledgement that even the original contested boundary had never truly favored Rourke. She stood there for a long moment in the dry October wind, with the smell of cedar around her and a hawk turning lazy circles overhead, and she felt something complicated and unwanted move through her chest. Then she heard the horse. He came up from the south, from the direction of the Rourke ranch's main buildings, riding a big gray gelding with the kind of unhurried confidence that only men who own a great deal of land are ever really able to manage. He was tall in the saddle and broad-shouldered, wearing a dust-colored coat and a hat that had seen years of honest weather. He had a dark beard kept close, and she had seen his face before only twice, across the crowded floor of the Harlow Creek courthouse at a distance. Up close, in the plain light of a working morning, he looked less like the villain she had constructed in her imagination and more like a man who had slept badly and was thinking about something with great seriousness. He pulled up perhaps 20 feet from her. "Mrs. Leland," he said. "Mr. Rourke," she said. There was a silence between them that had many things inside it. He looked at the fence line and then looked at her, and his expression was not triumphant, and it was not apologetic, and it was not the careful blankness of a man managing a legal strategy. It was something more direct than any of those things. "I moved the fence," he said. "I can see that," she said. "I wanted to do it before the hearing," he said, "so that it wasn't something the judge made me do. I wanted it to be something I chose to do." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them and lifted a strand of hair across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand. "That doesn't change what you did before," she said. "It doesn't change the fact that you've been pushing that line east for 3 years. "No," he said, "it doesn't. I still have a petition before Judge Alderman. I know, and I intend to keep it." He nodded once. He wasn't arguing with her. He wasn't doing any of the things she had expected him to do. He was just sitting on his horse in the October morning and looking at her with those dark, serious eyes, and she had the sudden, deeply unsettling feeling that she did not know this man at all, and that the man she had thought she knew had been a story she had told herself to make sense of her grief and her anger. "I came out here to show you what I did," he said, "and to ask if you'd stay for supper tonight." The words landed with a kind of gentle audacity that took her breath away for a moment. "Supper," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You moved my fence line and you want me to come to supper." "I moved the fence line correctly," he said, "and yes, I want you to come to supper." She stared at him. He looked back at her. The hawk overhead had been joined by a second one, and they circled together in that elaborate way hawks do, spiraling on the same column of warm air. "I'll think about it," she said. That was how it started. To understand how Louise Leland came to be standing alone in a field of cedar fence posts in the autumn of 1883, you had to go back at least 2 years, and really farther than that, back to the beginning of things, back to the decision she had made to come west in the first place. She had been born Louise Annabelle Prentice in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1855. The second of 4 children of a schoolteacher and a woman who ran a millinery shop and had very definite opinions about everything. She had grown up surrounded by books and opinions, and the particular Midwestern certainty that the world, with sufficient effort and intelligence, could be understood and navigated. She had been a good student, then a schoolteacher herself, and at 23 she had married Thomas Leland, who was 31, kind, quietly funny, and deeply convinced that the future of the American Republic was located somewhere west of the Missouri River. Thomas had tuberculosis. He did not know this when they married. He found out 2 years later, and the doctor suggested the dry air of the territories might extend his life considerably. Louise had stood in the doctor's office in Cincinnati and held her husband's hand while the word was delivered, and she had felt the future reorganize itself around her with the slow, terrible efficiency of water finding a new course. They had packed everything they owned into 2 freight wagons and made the journey to the Oklahoma and Kansas Territory border region in the spring of 1878, following the railhead as far as it went, and then continuing by wagon into the high grass country, where a man could still file a homestead claim of 160 acres under the Homestead Act if he was willing to put 5 years of improvement into it. Thomas was willing. Thomas was, in fact, deeply and romantically willing, in a way that Louise had always loved about him even when it exasperated her. They built a house. They dug a well. They broke 30 acres of sod in the first 2 years and planted winter wheat and a kitchen garden, and a small orchard of apple trees that were optimistic to the point of recklessness given the climate. Their daughter, Nora, was born in 1875, before the move west, and she adapted to the prairie with the resilience of children everywhere. Thomas improved for a while in the dry air. Then he did not improve, and in the spring of 1882 he died, and Louise buried him on the eastern edge of their property under a limestone marker that she had paid a stonemason in Harlow Creek to carve. She was 27 years old, alone with a 7-year-old daughter, 160 acres of dry Oklahoma grassland, a small herd of cattle that Thomas had started building, and debts. Not catastrophic debts, but real ones, the the kind that required continuous management and a clear eye toward revenue. The first time she noticed that something was wrong with the fence line, it was the following summer, 1882, just a few months after Thomas died. She had been riding the southern boundary of their property and noticed that one of the original survey stakes she remembered driving herself 4 years earlier was now on the Rourke side of the fence. She had assumed it was an honest mistake at first. She went to speak to the foreman at the Rourke ranch, a man named Haggerty who had the carefully pleasant manner of someone who had been given a script to follow. Haggerty told her she must be misremembering the original location. He said this politely, with a sympathetic expression that acknowledged her recent bereavement. She wanted to throw something at him. She did not throw anything. She went home and found her copy of the original survey and studied it. She went to the county recorder's office in Harlow Creek and pulled the original filed maps. She measured. She documented. She went back a second time, and Haggerty was not sympathetic anymore. He told her the matter was settled. Over the following months, the fence moved twice more, each time a few feet east, each time during a period when she was occupied with something else, with Nora's illness in the fall, with the stress of the harvest, with the ongoing negotiations with the bank in Harlow Creek about the balance on the original land loan. She had never met Calvin Rourke directly. She knew him by reputation, which in that part of the Oklahoma Territory in 1883 was substantial. He had come into the territory in 1874, filed on a parcel originally, and then through a combination of purchase, lease, and some people said legal pressure, had expanded the Rourke ranch to nearly 12,000 acres. He was known as a man who paid his debts on time, treated his hands reasonably, and did not talk very much in public settings. He was also known, though people said this more quietly, as a man who had a talent for finding the edges of things and pushing them. Louise spent 6 months building her case before she filed the petition. She was not a woman who acted without preparation. She had the schoolteacher's devotion to evidence, and the frontier widow's understanding that no one was going to advocate for her interests unless she did it herself. She filed in September of 1883, asking Judge Alderman to order a resurvey of the property line and award damages for the acreage that had been incrementally absorbed by the Rourke ranch. And then, on a clear October morning 4 days before the hearing, she rode out to check the fence line one more time and found it already corrected. She rode home thinking about supper. She spent the rest of that day trying not to think about supper, which meant that she thought about very little else. She milked the cow with mechanical efficiency and thought about the impossible audacity of a man who moves your fence and then invites you to eat at his table. She fed Nora breakfast and thought about the darkness of his eyes in the October light, which was an observation she had no business making. She sat at the kitchen table with her survey notes spread in front of her and attempted to calculate the acreage she had recovered and the financial implications thereof, and instead found herself going over the brief conversation at the fence line word by word, replaying his voice saying, "I wanted it to be something I chose to do." Nora, who was 8 years old and possessed of the terrifying perceptiveness of children who spend a great deal of time in adult company, watched her mother throughout the day with calm, interested eyes. "You're thinking about something," Nora said at lunch. "I'm always thinking about something," Louise said. "Something different." Louise looked at her daughter, who had Thomas's coloring and her own stubborn mouth. "I saw the Rourke rancher this morning," she said. "He moved the fence back where it belongs." Nora considered this. "That's good," she said. "Yes, but it's making you worried." "I don't know what it's making me," Louise said honestly. The invitation was making her aware of herself in a way that she had not been aware of herself in a long time. It was making her aware of the fact that she was a woman in her late 20s, not old, not past anything, but so deeply submerged in the practical demands of survival that she had forgotten somewhat that the survival was supposed to be in service of living. It was making her aware, unwillingly and with considerable irritation, that she had been lonely for much longer than the 18 months since Thomas died. That some of the loneliness had predated his death, had been present in the last 2 or 3 years of his illness when he was physically present but increasingly distant, consumed by the effort of breathing. She thought about this, and then set it aside because there was fencing to check on the northern boundary, and the cow needed worming, and the school in Harlow Creek had sent a note about Nora missing too many days. She did not decide to accept the invitation. She decided to think about it until Thursday, by which time the question might have resolved itself. Instead, she saddled her mare the following morning, a Tuesday, and rode to the Rourke ranch. She told herself she was going to discuss the hearing, to notify him formally that despite the fence correction, she intended to continue with the petition. This was true, but it was not the whole truth, and Louise Leland had always been uncomfortable with incomplete truths, even when the incomplete portion was one she could not yet name clearly. The Rourke Ranch was impressive in the way that things built with money and sustained effort become impressive, not flashy but solid, with a permanence that spoke of long intentions. The main house was a 2-story frame structure with a covered porch running the full length of the front, freshly painted in a white that was almost startling against the tawny grass of October. There were 3 barns and a bunkhouse, and a series of corrals with horses that even at distance looked well-bred and well-kept. There was a kitchen garden on the south side of the house that had been put to bed for the winter with evident care, the beds mulched and covered, the stakes for beans and tomatoes collected and bundled neatly along the fence. Someone here cared about growing things. A hand came out of the barn as she rode in, a young man with a freckled face who took her horse with the easy courtesy of someone who had been raised to do it. She asked for Mr. Rourke and was directed to the North Corral, where she found Calvin Rourke on foot inside the fence with a young roan horse that was not yet comfortable with saddle or rider. He was working the horse with a long line, moving it through circles in the dust, asking it gently for transitions, and it was clear that he knew what he was doing. There was a patience in how he stood, in the quiet way he held the line, that was different from the stiff formality of their conversation at the fence. Seemed working with the horse like someone who was more himself than he might be in other circumstances. He saw her and brought the roan down to a halt, wrapped the line, and came to the fence. "Mrs. Leland," he said, "I hoped you'd come." "I want to talk about the hearing," she said. "All right, I'm keeping the petition." He nodded. He had taken his hat off when he came to the fence, and his hair was dark and slightly damp at the temples from the work. "I expected that," he said. "I think you should." She looked at him carefully. "You think I should contest you before a judge?" "I think the whole thing should be on record," he said. "I think what I did was wrong, and it should be on record that I corrected it. A judge's ruling creates a permanent record. If I were in your position, I'd want a permanent record." She was quiet for a moment. The roan moved behind him in the dust, blowing softly. "Who handled the fence moving?" she asked. "Was it your instruction, or was it Haggerty?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite guilt, but the recognition of a question he had been expecting and perhaps preparing for. "The original placement was done by Haggerty," he said, "against my explicit instruction. I found out about the incremental movement 6 months ago. I should have corrected it immediately. I didn't because I was dealing with matters that I let take priority, and that was wrong. The delay was my responsibility." "You knew for 6 months," she said. "Yes. And you waited until 4 days before the hearing." "I did." "Why then? Why not the day you found out?" He looked at her steadily. There was no flinching in him, she noted. He did not look at the ground or find something convenient in the middle distance. He held her gaze with the directness of someone who has decided that honesty, even when it costs something, was the only option that left you feeling like yourself. "Because I was afraid," he said, "that if I came to you directly, too soon after your husband's death, it would seem like something other than what it was. And then I let too much time pass, and I let the petition be filed, and by the time I moved the fence it was late and the timing looked strategic. I'm not sure it wasn't partially. I'm not sure my motives are as uncomplicated as I'd like them to be." She stood at the fence rail and looked at him and felt the complicated thing in her chest move again, heavier this time. "That's an extraordinary amount of honesty," she said. "I have a dark past with dishonesty," he said. "I was dishonest with myself for a long time about a number of things, and it cost me. I don't recommend it." She wanted to ask what things. She did not ask because it wasn't the right moment and because she was already unsettled enough. "I'll attend the hearing," she said, "and if Judge Alderman issues a ruling in my favor, I expect you to comply with it fully." "I will," he said. "And I'll come to supper," she said, and was surprised to hear herself say it. A small thing moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "Tonight?" he asked. "Thursday," she said, "after the hearing." She rode home feeling the wind on her face, and something in her chest that she could not accurately name, but that felt, underneath the caution and the grief, and the practical calculations of a woman alone on 160 acres of Oklahoma grassland, like the first green thing pushing through ground that had been frozen for a long time. The hearing before Judge Alderman on Thursday was short, because Calvin Rourke did not contest it. He stood before the judge in the small courtroom of the Harlow Creek County Courthouse, in a clean black coat and a white shirt that looked newly pressed, and he agreed to every point in Louise Leland's petition. He agreed that the original survey stakes had been correct. He agreed that the fence had been moved in a series of incremental encroachments between 1882 and 1883. He agreed that the acreage absorbed during that period had been genuinely removed from the Leland property. He agreed that the corrected fence line, as established 3 days prior, accurately reflected the true and legal boundary between the two properties. Judge Alderman, a man in his 60s with a vast gray mustache and the weary patience of someone who had heard everything twice, looked at Calvin Rourke over his reading glasses for a long moment. "You're not disputing any of this," he said. "No, Your Honor," said Calvin. "You understand that I'm entering this into the permanent record of this court." "I understand, and I think that's appropriate." Judge Alderman then looked at Louise Leland, who was sitting at the table on the other side of the courtroom in a dark green dress that was her best and only dress that wasn't black, and he said, "Mrs. Leland, your petition is granted in full. The fence line, as corrected, is hereby recognized as the legal and permanent boundary. Do you wish to pursue any claim for damages?" Louise had thought about this carefully. She had calculated what the lost acreage had cost her in terms of reduced grazing capacity and potential lost cattle revenue. She had sat with those numbers for 2 evenings and turned them in her mind. "No, Your Honor," she said. "The correction of the fence is the remedy I sought." Judge Alderman looked between them one more time with the expression of a man who was professionally required to be impartial but was personally curious about what was happening here, and he banged his gavel and called the matter closed. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Calvin found her before she reached the stairs. "Mrs. Leland," he said. She turned. "Tonight," he said, "supper if you're still willing." She looked at him in the dim light of the courthouse corridor, with the sounds of the street coming through the tall windows and somewhere down the hall another matter being called into session. "I'll need to bring Nora," she said. "I have no one to leave her with." "Please bring her," he said. "I'd be glad to have her." Louise arrived at the Rourke Ranch at 6 o'clock with Nora sitting behind her on the sorrel mare, arms wrapped around her mother's waist, wearing her second-best dress and an expression of vigilant interest. The evening sky was the color of copper and old rose, and the air had turned cold the way October evenings do in the territory, suddenly and completely, as though the warmth of the day had been a loan that the night was calling in. Calvin met them in the yard. He had changed from the courthouse clothes into something more practical, but still clearly made an effort. A dark flannel shirt that was clean and well-fitted, dark trousers. He helped Louise down first and then lifted Nora off the horse with a natural ease that suggested he was comfortable with children, and set her on the ground gently. "You must be Nora," he said. "Yes," Nora said, studying him. "You're the man who moved the fence." "I am," he said without embarrassment. "And then you moved it back." "That's right." Nora considered this assessment with the judicial seriousness of an 8-year-old. "That's what you're supposed to do," she said finally, "when you've done something wrong." "You're absolutely right," Calvin said, and there was warmth in his voice that was genuine and not performed. Louise watched this exchange and felt something loosen in her chest. The inside of the ranch house was not what she had expected. She had expected the sparse functionality of a bachelor's home, the minimum necessary furniture, and a deep indifference to anything decorative. Instead, the house was well furnished in a way that spoke of taste and a degree of deliberate effort. There were rugs on the pine floors and good oil lamps casting warm light, and on the mantelpiece above the stone fireplace there were 2 framed photographs and a collection of books that she immediately wanted to look at more closely. The kitchen smelled extraordinary. "Do you cook yourself?" she asked, because she had to. "I do," he said. "My mother believed that a man who could not feed himself was a man making himself into a burden." He paused. "I've had a housekeeper for the past 3 years, Mrs. Caldwell, but she's visiting her sister in Tulsa this week and I've managed." "What are we having?" Nora asked, because Nora had no patience for circuitous conversation. "Roast chicken with biscuits and green beans I put up this summer," Calvin said, "and apple cake." "You put up beans," Louise said. "Is that surprising?" "It's unexpected," she said. Something moved in his expression. "There's a great deal about me that people find unexpected," he said, and it was said lightly, but she heard what was underneath it. The slight weight of a man who had been misunderstood often enough that he had stopped trying to correct it, except in direct, one-on-one situations. She wondered again about the dark past he had mentioned. She wondered about what it was that dishonesty had cost him. Supper was remarkable. Not just the food, though the food was genuinely excellent, the chicken well seasoned, and the biscuits light in the way that requires real attention, but the quality of the conversation. Calvin had the rare ability to be genuinely interested in the person he was talking to ask questions that were specific rather than general, and to listen to the answers with full attention. He asked Nora about her school subjects, and engaged with her answers about arithmetic and geography as though her opinions were worth hearing, which Nora clearly found both unusual and deeply gratifying. He asked Louise about the Leland cattle operation with the knowledgeable specificity of a fellow rancher, rather than the dismissive politeness she was accustomed to from men in that context. "You're running about 40 head," he said. 43, she said. "I need to get to 60 to make the operation viable long-term. I know that." "What's holding you back?" "Capital, primarily. The loan from the Harlow Creek Bank is structured such that I can't take additional credit against the land without Thomas's estate being formally settled, and the estate settlement is tied up in probate because Thomas didn't have a formal will." Calvin frowned. "Who's handling the probate?" "Nobody, technically. I've been managing it myself because the attorney fees are something I can't sustain right now." He was quiet for a moment. "I know the county probate attorney," he said. "He was a friend of my father's. If you're willing, I could ask him to look at the estate filing. He might be willing to defer his fees given the situation." She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was warm between them, and Nora was applying herself to her apple cake with complete concentration. "Why would you do that?" she said. The question came out more bluntly than she intended, but she meant it and she wanted the actual answer. "Because I want to," he said simply. "That's not a complete answer." He held her gaze. "Because I caused you harm and I want to help repair it," he said. "And because you are clearly more capable than most people in this territory have recognized, and capable people being blocked by procedural obstacles is a waste." He paused. "And because I would like to continue having conversations like this one." The honesty of it landed directly, without padding or diplomatic softening, and she felt her face warm in a way that she was grateful the lamplight partially concealed. "I'll think about it," she said, which was what she had said at the fence line, and which meant something slightly different this time. The ride home after dark was cold and clear, with stars so thick overhead they seemed to be pressing down toward the earth. Nora sat behind her mother and fell asleep against her back for the second half of the ride, swaying gently with the mare's walk, her arms loose around Louise's waist. Louise rode through the cold November air and thought about Calvin Rourke's voice and his careful hands working the roan horse, and the way he had looked at her across the supper table, and the way that look had made her feel seen in a way that she was not accustomed to. She was afraid of that feeling. She knew she was afraid of it, and she knew exactly why, and she rode through the dark being afraid of it with great clarity and honesty, because those were the terms on which Louise Leland operated. She was afraid because Thomas had been a good man and she had loved him and she had not stopped loving him, and feeling something beginning in the direction of another man felt like a betrayal of the simplest, most private kind. She was afraid because she had built her entire current life on the premise of her own self-sufficiency, and the pleasure she had felt sitting at Calvin Rourke's table with Nora's laughter in the air was a pleasure that came from its opposite, from not being alone, and she did not entirely trust pleasure that had a dependence at its core. And she was afraid, most honestly, because Calvin Rourke was a man who had done something wrong to her, slowly and systematically, even if the primary agent was Haggerty, and even if Calvin's culpability was one of negligence rather than direct malice, and she did not know what it meant that she was sitting here in the dark, finding herself drawn toward a man who had spent 1.5 years eroding the edges of her property. She told herself she would be careful. She arrived home, put the mare in the small barn, carried a sleeping Nora into the house and put her to bed, and then sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time before she lit the lamp. Calvin came to her property 3 days later. He arrived at mid-morning with a team of his own men and a wagon loaded with cedar posts and wire, and asked, hat in hand, if she needed any work done on the perimeter fencing that the previous years of boundary confusion might have left in disrepair. She stood in the doorway of her house and looked at him and at the men and the wagon, and tried to determine if this was something she could accept without compromising the independence she had built such careful scaffolding around. "I'll pay for the materials and the labor," she said. "There's no need," he started. "I'll pay," she said. "I'll calculate the cost at market rate and pay you back over 6 months if you'll allow it." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the impression that he was revising something in his understanding of her, not downward but toward greater accuracy, toward a fuller and more correct picture. "All right," he said, "whatever makes you comfortable." The fencing work took 2 days. On the first day, Louise worked alongside the Rourke hands, because it was her fence and her land, and she saw no reason why she should stand back from physical work simply because she was a woman and there were men present to do it. She had spent 5 years on the Oklahoma prairie, and she knew how to stretch wire and set posts, and she was not slow at it. The men were initially uncertain about this, but adapted quickly, and by the end of the first day, there was an easy working rhythm that she found satisfying in the uncomplicated way physical outdoor work always satisfied her. Calvin was there both days. He did not supervise from horseback. He worked with the same direct physical capability he had shown with the roan horse, and she found herself watching him in the corners of her attention, observing the way he handled himself, the patience with which he showed the younger hands how to brace a corner post correctly, the easy back and forth with the men that suggested a relationship of genuine mutual respect, rather than the enforced deference she had seen on some larger operations. At the end of the second day, while the hands were loading the remaining materials back onto the wagon, he came and stood near her at the corner of the north field, where they had run the last section of new wire. The sun was very low and the grass was all copper and gold, and the air had the particular sweetness of a late autumn evening in good country, even dry country, even country that had asked a great deal of the people who had tried to make a life on it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "What did dishonesty cost you? You said it had cost you. What did you mean?" He was quiet for a while. She had noticed that he was a man who did not rush to fill silence, who let things have the weight they needed before he responded. "I had a wife," he said, "years ago, before I came to the territory." She had not known this. She had not known there was a wife. "Her name was Eleanor," he said. "We married when I was 23. I was already starting to do well in cattle trading back in Missouri, and I was ambitious in the way that young men are ambitious, when they haven't yet understood that ambition is only worth anything if you're pointed at the right things." He paused. "I was dishonest with her about what I was doing with my time, not in the way you might think. I wasn't dishonest with women or drink. I was dishonest about the degree to which I was prioritizing the business over the marriage. I told her and myself that what I was building was for both of us, for a future we'd share, and the truth was that it was for me and my idea of myself, and she was secondary to that idea in ways I didn't acknowledge until it was too late." Louise listened without speaking. "She left in 1876, he said. "She went back to Missouri, to her family. We divorced, which was difficult for both of us and cost us both socially and in terms of what our communities thought of us. I came out here in 1874, 2 years before she left, because I thought the territory was the future and I wanted to be part of building it. She never liked it here. I didn't listen carefully enough to that." He looked out over the fence line. "After she left, I spent a year being very angry, mostly at myself in ways I was directing outward, and then I spent another few years building this ranch and being very alone and gradually figuring out what I actually believed about how to live." "How old are you?" she asked. 33, he said. She was 28. The distance between them was not unreasonable. "I'm sorry about Eleanor," she said. "I was sorry about it too," he said. "But I understand it now. I don't think I was capable at 23 of being the husband she needed or the husband anyone deserved. I wasn't honest enough with myself yet." She thought about this. About the particular kind of self-knowledge he was describing, the hard-won variety that came from loss and the willingness to examine the loss honestly. "Thomas was honest to a fault," she said, because she wanted to offer something equivalent, because the exchange of difficult truths felt important. "He was honest in the way that was sometimes almost unkind, not cruelly but with a precision that didn't always account for timing. I loved that about him, and it also sometimes made me want to scream." She felt the familiar mix of grief and affection that came with thinking about Thomas. He had a beautiful vision of what this land could be. He just ran out of time to make it. "You're making it," Calvin said. She looked at him. "His vision," Calvin said. "You're making it. 43 head and 160 acres and a daughter who knows how to assess a person's character. That's not nothing. That's a considerable amount of something." She felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "You should know," she said when she had a grip on it, "that I am not in any way naive about what I feel or what it might mean. I'm not a young girl. I understand what I am and what my situation is, and what kind of leverage a woman in my position is vulnerable to." "I know you're not naive," he said. "I think you're one of the least naive people I've ever met." "I want that acknowledged," she said, "so that we understand each other." "We understand each other," he said. They stood side by side in the last of the evening light with the new fence running straight and clean between them and the good winter air moving through the grass, and there was a quality to the silence that had changed from every previous silence between them. It was no longer charged with opposition. It had become something else, something with a question in it that neither of them was in any hurry to answer incorrectly. November in the Oklahoma Territory was a month of long gray skies and sudden hard frosts, and the dry creak of the grass at night when the temperature dropped sharply. Louise spent the month managing her cattle, fighting a respiratory illness that moved through the herd and required 2 weeks of intensive attention before it resolved, schooling Nora when the road to Harlow Creek was too bad for the ride, and corresponding with the probate attorney that Calvin had contacted on her behalf. The attorney's name was Hartwell, and he was in his 50s and brisk and efficient in his letters, and by the middle of November He had written to tell her that the estate of Thomas Leland could be formally settled within 6 weeks if she could provide certain documents that were listed, and that his fees were substantially reduced because of the circumstances, and because, he wrote, a Mr. Calvin Rourke had been generous enough to cover the difference. She wrote back to Hartwell and thanked him. Then she sat down and wrote to Calvin. She had written to him twice before since the hearing, businesslike notes about the fencing costs and the repayment schedule. This letter was different. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Rourke, Mr. Hartwell has told me that you have covered a portion of his fees. I want you to know that I both appreciate this and intend to repay it, and that I am aware of the distinction between generosity and obligation, and it is important to me that you are aware of it too. I am not a woman who can be bought, nor am I a woman who confuses financial assistance with emotional debt. I am, however, a woman who knows when she has been treated with genuine consideration, and I want to acknowledge that I know the difference. Yours sincerely, Louise Leland." She sent Nora to the post office with it on a Monday morning. His reply came back Wednesday. It said, "Dear Mrs. Leland, I understood this about you at the fence line on the first morning. That is not why I called the attorney. I called him because the situation was partly my fault, and because you should not be paying the full price of it. As for being bought, the idea had not crossed my mind, and I suspect the reason it hadn't is that I have some instinct for what is and isn't possible, and that particular possibility seemed so remote as to be not worth considering. I am glad you are progressing with the estate. I hope Nora is well. Yours sincerely, Calvin Rourke." She read this letter 3 times. Then she put it in the drawer with the survey notes and the original land deed and the photograph of herself and Thomas, taken in Cincinnati the summer before they left for the West. In the second week of November, the probate proceedings required her to go into Harlow Creek for a meeting with Hartwell at his office, and she ran into Calvin on the main street afterward, quite by chance, both of them stepping out of different shops onto the same stretch of boardwalk at approximately the same time. The collision of their surprise was almost comic, and they stood on the boardwalk in the thin November sunshine and looked at each other. "How did the meeting go?" he asked. "Well," she said. "Hartwell thinks it will be settled before Christmas." "That's good news." "Yes." They stood there on the busy street of a small frontier town with people moving around them and horses tied at the rail and the cold blue sky overhead, and there was the same quality in the air that had been at the fence in the evening, the sense of a question that needed answering. "Are you heading back today?" he asked. "This afternoon," she said. "I left Nora with Mrs. Cooper and I promised to be back by supper." "Let me buy you coffee," he said, "before you head out." The Harlow Creek Hotel had a small dining room that served coffee and pie on weekday afternoons, and they sat at a table by the window with the street outside and the sky beyond it and drank coffee and talked for 2 hours. Not about the land or the petition or the estate. They talked about books, because she had seen the books on his mantelpiece and had been wanting to ask about them since the supper. He had read widely, and well for a man who had built his education primarily in solitude, and she found the pleasure of talking about ideas with someone who had genuinely engaged with them to be almost luxurious, a kind of richness she had not experienced since the intellectual life of Cincinnati, which felt like another world and another self. They talked about the territory, about what it might become, about the ongoing dispossession of the native peoples of the region, which was something that sat uncomfortably with Louise, and which she said so directly, watching to see how he responded. He did not deflect or minimize. He said that he had complicated feelings about the land he had built his operation on, that he knew the history of how the territory had been open to settlement, and that history was not comfortable, and that he thought the least a person could do in that situation was not pretend the discomfort wasn't real. She liked him enormously in that moment. Not in the dangerous, warm way she had been trying to manage carefully, but in the deeper, quieter way of recognizing genuine moral seriousness in another person. "You are not what I expected," she said. "I know," he said. I had a very complete villain in my head, she said. You were convenient for a time. He smiled then, and it was a real one, and she saw what his face did when he allowed it to relax fully into an expression, and her heart did something that she noted and kept moving. Outside on the street, a wagon went by with a load of lumber, and behind it a group of cowboys heading for the saloon at the far end of town, and the ordinary life of the frontier town moved around them, and they sat in the window and drank their coffee and talked. She rode home in the late afternoon through the blue cold of the Oklahoma November, with a feeling she could not in honesty any longer pretend not to recognize. By December, the Leland estate had been formally settled, which meant that the land was now titled in Louise's name outright, with no encumbrances from the probate process. She received the papers from Hartwell on a Friday morning, a thin sheaf of legal documents that represented the full legal recognition of everything she had built, everything Thomas had started and she had carried forward alone. She sat at the kitchen table and read them through twice, and then held them quietly for a moment. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the trip west, the wagon creaking through the Missouri grasslands in the spring sun, Thomas optimistic and excited, and already, she had not known then, already sick. She thought about all the things she had carried since then, and she let herself feel the weight of them, and then she let it ease somewhat, not gone, never gone, but bearable in a way that it sometimes was not. She wrote to Calvin that afternoon, not a businesslike note. She told him the estate had settled and thanked him for the Hartwell introduction, and then she wrote, I find myself wanting to tell you this because you are one of the very few people who understood what the petition was really about, which was not just the fence. I don't think I have said that clearly before. It was about the right to still be here, about the fact that the land is Thomas's promise and my work, and I will not have it reduced by negligence or ambition. The fence being correct feels today like the land being mine in a way that the paperwork alone doesn't entirely capture. I thought you would understand this. I hope you are well. His reply came the following Tuesday and was the longest letter he had written yet. He wrote about what it had felt like to build something on land in a new place, about the difference between owning land and belonging to it, which he said he had taken years to understand, and was not certain he understood fully even now. He wrote about the Osage who had been removed from this territory 20 years before the settlement rush, and how the landscape still bore traces of how they had managed it. The controlled burns that kept certain stretches of prairie open, the specific pattern of certain creek plantings that were clearly tended rather than wild. He wrote, I think belonging to a place requires being honest about what the place has been as well as what it is now, and that is a complicated accounting. Your determination to hold the Leland land is one form of honesty about what it cost. I think that matters. She read this letter in front of the fire with Nora asleep in the next room, and the wind pressing against the walls of the house, and the smell of pine smoke in the air, and she understood that she was in love with this man. Not falling toward it, not on the edge of it, in it. Somewhere in the past 6 weeks of letters and coffee and fence lines and honest conversation, she had crossed a threshold she had not been watching carefully enough, or had been watching too carefully in the wrong direction. She sat with this knowledge for a long time. She turned it. She examined it from the angles that frightened her, the vulnerability of it, the history between them that had started in opposition, the fact of Thomas, the fact of Nora, the very real practical complications of two people with adjoining land operations and a recent legal dispute. She found that all of these things were true, and that the thing she felt was also true, and that the two sets of truths were not incompatible. They just required care. They required the kind of slow, deliberate attention that she had learned to give to everything on the frontier, the understanding that good things needed tending. She wrote back the following morning. She wrote about her father teaching her to read. She wrote about the smell of her mother's millinery shop, the particular combination of straw and ribbon, and the cedar closets. She wrote about what Thomas had been like in the early years, before the illness, the quality of his laughter and his tendency to name every working animal on the property with elaborate formal names that were completely incongruous. The way he had named their cow Duchess of Wellington and their mule Archduke France. She wrote these things and offered them freely, as gifts, as the kind of offering you make when you have decided to open a door. She sent the letter with the Harlow Creek mail rider and spent the rest of the day with a feeling that was terrifying and bright. Christmas in the Oklahoma Territory in 1883 was cold and clear. Louise and Nora drove into Harlow Creek on the 23rd for the church service and the town gathering, and Calvin was there, standing with a group of ranchers near the church door, and when he saw her, he crossed the space between them with a directness that made several people near her notice. "Mrs. Leland," he said. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "Would you and Nora join me for Christmas dinner tomorrow?" he said. "I'll be alone otherwise." She looked at him and thought about doors and thresholds, and the quality of courage required to want something and say so clearly. "We'd like that," she said. Christmas dinner at the Rourke Ranch was long and generous. He had a goose from one of the neighboring farms and potatoes and a dried fruit pie, and several gifts for Nora that he produced from somewhere with such apparent offhandedness that only Louise, watching carefully, could see the thought that had gone into them. A book of illustrated geography and a set of colored pencils and a small carved wooden horse that was clearly not a manufactured item, but had been made by someone who could carve with considerable skill. "Did you make this?" Nora asked, turning the horse in her hands. "I did," Calvin said. "It looks like your gray horse," Nora said. "It does a bit," Calvin said. Louise looked at him across the table, and something passed between them in the warm lamplight of Christmas Day, in the presence of her daughter's delight, and the smell of good food and the fire, something that needed no words and required none. After supper, when Nora had fallen asleep on the settee in the parlor with the carved horse in one hand and the geography book on her chest, Louise and Calvin sat in the two chairs on either side of the fireplace and talked in low voices, and the fire went down to coals, and outside the stars were extraordinary over the Oklahoma plain. He said, after a long, warm silence, "Louise." It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked at him across the fireplace. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said quietly. "I think you are the most remarkable person I've met in this territory," he said. "And I think I've been in love with you since approximately the second conversation at the fence line, which is a feeling I've been managing with great care because I was aware of the situation and aware that you had every reason to regard me with suspicion, and I did not want to use the feeling as a way to pressure anything." She was quiet for a moment. "You have been the most carefully behaved man," she said, and there was warmth in her voice. "I told you I learned from being dishonest," he said. "Calvin," she said, using his name in return deliberately. "Yes, I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been for some time. I've been examining it from every angle I can think of, and it doesn't change." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. His hand was large and warm and calloused from work, and she held it with both of hers and felt the quiet rightness of it all the way through. "I'm not going to rush anything," he said. "I want you to know that. I understand what you've built, and I have no intention of being a complication in it." "You're already a complication in it," she said and smiled. "A welcome one, I hope," he said. "The most welcome thing that's happened to me in a long time," she said. January came in hard, with a blizzard that swept down from the north in the first week and kept everyone inside for 4 days. Louise spent the blizzard at the Leland homestead with Nora, managing the livestock through the worst of it, digging paths through the snow to the small barn 3 times a day, keeping the wood stove running, and feeling, throughout the white isolation of it, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She and Calvin had agreed that they would proceed slowly and honestly, and with Nora's well-being as a constant consideration. Nora knew that her mother was fond of Mr. Rourke and had expressed opinions about this that were largely favorable and characteristically direct. the main concern she articulated being whether the carved horse was hers to keep permanently regardless of what the adults decided to do. They were both assured on this point. In February, on a Sunday when the weather had cleared, and the prairie lay quiet and white under a sky of piercing blue, Calvin drove over to the Leland place with his wagon, and they worked together in the barn with the cattle for the better part of the morning. And at noon, they stood outside in the cold sun, eating bread and cheese from a cloth, and Nora was building something elaborate in the snow nearby. And Calvin put his arm around Louise's shoulders, and she leaned into him, and the warmth and weight of it was simple and complete, and felt like something she had been moving toward for a long time. In March, when the ice on the creek had melted and the first tentative green was beginning to show on the south-facing slopes, Calvin asked her to marry him. He did it without theater or elaborate staging. They were walking along the creek on a Sunday afternoon while Nora ran ahead among the bare cottonwoods, and he stopped walking and took her hand and said that he wanted to spend the rest of his life building something with her, that he thought they were better suited to each other than two people had a right to expect, and that he would be honored if she would consent to be his wife. She held his hand in both of hers and looked up at him with the creek running cold and clear beside them and the smell of spring in the air. "Yes," she said, "with conditions." "Of course," he said, which was exactly the right answer. The conditions were practical and she had thought them through carefully over the preceding weeks. She wanted to retain the Leland homestead in her own name, not absorbed into the Rourke Ranch property but maintained as a distinct legal holding, because it was Thomas's land and it was Nora's inheritance, and it deserved to remain itself. She wanted a formal legal agreement about this before the wedding. She wanted Nora to have full rights of inheritance on both properties. Calvin agreed to all of it without hesitation. He said, in fact, that he had expected these conditions and had already spoken to an attorney in Harlow Creek about the property structure. She looked at him with something that was equal parts affection and exasperation. "You anticipated my conditions," she said. "I told you I have an instinct for what's possible," he said. "You're incorrigible," she said. "I prefer thorough," he said, and she laughed. A full, clear laugh that startled a bird from the cottonwood above them and made Nora turn and look and smile with the knowing expression of a child who understood what she was seeing. They were married in Harlow Creek on the 15th of April, 1884, in a ceremony at the small Methodist church on the main street. It was a clear spring day with a wind that moved the new grass and the women's skirts and the ribbons on Nora's hat. The church was full because, in a small frontier town, a wedding was a significant social occasion, and people came from considerable distances. Louise wore a dress that she and Mrs. Cooper's wife had made together over the preceding 3 weeks, cream-colored wool with a small pattern of blue flowers at the collar, and she carried a bundle of early spring wildflowers that Nora had collected that morning. Calvin stood at the front of the church in a dark suit that was clearly new and looked at her as she came down the aisle with an expression that was so openly and unguardedly full of love that several people in the congregation were visibly moved by it. The vows were the standard ones. Louise said them clearly and with full intention. Calvin said them with the measured precision of a man who treats words seriously and means each one. Judge Alderman was in the congregation, which Louise thought was quietly appropriate, and he nodded at her with the warm approval of a man who had seen many things come through his courtroom and was glad when some of them came out well. The first year of their marriage was rich and full, and sometimes difficult in the way that any true thing requires difficulty to deepen. They had 2 households to manage and a combined cattle operation to integrate, and the ordinary friction of 2 independent adults who had each spent years making all their own decisions, now needing to make them together. There were disagreements, some of them substantial, about the direction of the cattle operation and about the management of the Leland land, and they had these disagreements with the same directness and honesty that had characterized everything between them from the beginning. Louise had opinions about cattle breeding that were based on 5 years of independent operation and were occasionally in direct conflict with Calvin's longer experience. The outcome of several of these disagreements proved her correct, and Calvin acknowledged this without difficulty, which was one of the things she loved most about him. He was not a man who needed to be right more than he needed to be accurate. Nora adapted to the change in household with the flexibility and pragmatism of a child who had already made one major life transition, the move west, and who had always been comfortable with adults who treated her with genuine respect. She and Calvin developed their own relationship that was separate from his relationship with Louise, based on a shared interest in horses and in the carved wooden animals that gradually accumulated on the windowsill of her room, one new one appearing every few weeks, never presented with ceremony, just there one morning where it hadn't been before. In the summer of 1885, Louise discovered she was expecting a child. She told Calvin on a warm June evening on the porch, sitting with the last of the day's light on the grass and the cicadas beginning in the creek brush. He went very still when she told him. Then he turned to look at her, and his face had a quality she had seen only a few times, the full openness of a moment that could not be managed or prepared for. "Are you well?" he said. "How are you feeling?" "Very well," she said. "A little sick in the mornings, otherwise well." He took her hand and held it and was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy?" she asked, because she wanted to hear him say it. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life," he said. "And I want you to know that what we have right now, this was already everything. Whatever else comes is more than I expected." The baby was born in February of 1886, a boy, large and healthy, and possessed from the first hours of a remarkable volume and a clearly determined personality. They named him James Thomas Rourke, the Thomas for Louise's husband and Nora's father, whose name deserved to be carried forward in the family regardless of what the legal documents said about property lines. Calvin held his son for the first time while Louise slept in the exhaustion of a long labor, sitting in the chair by the bed with James Thomas in his arms, and Nora stood in the doorway and watched her stepfather hold her baby brother. And there was something in her expression that she would not have been able to articulate, but that was about continuity and love, and the way that broken things, if you are patient and honest, have a way of becoming whole again in shapes you did not expect. The Leland homestead became, over the following years, a part of the larger operation in practical terms while remaining legally distinct, which was the balance Louise had insisted on, and which proved to be exactly the right structure. She ran the Leland cattle under her own brand, the LL Bar, which she had registered in her own name in 1882 and kept, and the two herds grazed ranges that were managed in coordination but remained accountable separately on the books. She had a head for figures and for the interconnected calculations of grazing capacity and market timing, and the combined operation thrived. In the spring of 1887, Calvin received a letter from Missouri that required him to travel back for a period of several weeks to settle matters related to his late father's estate, property that had been in litigation since the old man's death 2 years earlier. He went reluctantly and wrote to Louise every few days with the details of the Missouri proceedings and descriptions of a landscape that was greener and more humid than the Oklahoma territory, and that felt, he wrote, like somewhere he used to be rather than anywhere he was. In Missouri, he ran into a leaner. He wrote to Louise about it immediately, the same day, a long letter that was characteristically direct about what the encounter had been and what it had meant. A leaner was remarried to a man in St. Louis, and she seemed, he wrote, genuinely happy in the settled, forward-looking way of someone who had made peace with a chapter of their life. They had spoken briefly and with courtesy. There was no lingering feeling on either side, only the mild, bittersweet acknowledgment of how different they had both become from the people who had stumbled through that early marriage. He wrote, "I told her I was married again and that I had a son and a daughter. She asked me if I was happy, and I told her that happy was barely adequate to describe it. She said she was glad, and I believed her. I think the life that was right for each of us was not the life we tried to make together, and that is nobody's fault and takes nothing away from anything. I am coming home as soon as the estate matter allows. I miss you, and I miss James, and I miss Nora's morning commentary on current events. Louise read this letter at the kitchen table with James in her lap, pulling at her braid with the focused determination of a 1-year-old. And she felt such a complete and uncomplicated gratitude for the life she was in that it almost startled her. She wrote back, "Come home soon. James has said his second word. The first was apparently mama, and the second is emphatically horse, which tells you something about his priorities and probably about his future. The LL Bar cows have produced 7 calves this spring, and Nora has named all of them after historical figures, which is either a sign of excellent education or a slightly concerning degree of whimsy. We are all well. I love you. Come home." He came home in April, thinner from the travel and the Missouri humidity, which he said disagreed with him, and stood in the yard of the Rourke ranch in the spring sunshine while James toddled unsteadily across the grass, toward him, making the sound that was his version of Papa, and Calvin went down on one knee in the dirt of the yard to catch his son without ceremony or self-consciousness. And Louise stood on the porch watching, and felt the particular joy that is indistinguishable from grief in its intensity, the joy of recognizing that you are living in the very thing you had hoped for. By the end of 1888, the combined Leland-Rourke operation had grown to nearly 400 head. The Leland parcel had been fenced and cross-fenced properly. The original house had been expanded and improved. The water situation on the South Range had been addressed by a new windmill-fed tank that Calvin designed and built over the course of a very satisfying autumn project. And there was a genuine thriving quality to things that Louise recognized as the thing Thomas had meant when he talked about the future of the territory, the possibility of building something that would last. Nora was 13 now, serious and curious and capable with horses in a way that suggested she might do something interesting with that in time, and James was almost 3 and already operating at a level of pure kinetic energy and joy that was exhausting and entirely wonderful. He looked like Calvin and had Louise's stubbornness, and the combination was going to be interesting to navigate in the coming years. In the late spring of 1889, they found out Louise was expecting again. "Again," Nora said, with the precise inflection of a 13-year-old processing information. "Is that a problem?" Louise said. "No," Nora said after a moment of consideration. "I'm just organizing." The second baby was a girl, born in January of 1890, who they named Clara Eleanor Rourke, the Eleanor for Calvin's mother, who had died in 1886, and had been, by all accounts, the source of his capacity for honest self-examination. A woman who had run a large household in Missouri with the combination of warmth and plain speaking that she had passed, evidently, to her son. Clara was dark-haired and calm from the beginning, a quality that was restful in contrast to James's perpetual motion, and she had Calvin's quiet dark eyes and studied everything she encountered with a seriousness that made even strangers feel they were being assessed. The family settled into the rhythm of the years with the particular ease of people who have built their life on a foundation they are confident in. There were hard years, because the territory always had hard years. The drought of 1891 that reduced the grass and required them to sell part of the herd at difficult prices. The winter of 1892 to 1893 that was the coldest on record and tested every structure and every supply and every person's endurance. But they navigated these things together with the practical competence of experienced ranchers and the deeper resource of a marriage that was genuinely equal, genuinely honest, and genuinely in love. Calvin never stopped carving. The collection on the windowsills of the house grew over the years to include horses and cattle and dogs and birds, and a remarkable carved bear that James at age 4 had requested with the uncompromising specificity of a child who knows what he wants, and which Calvin had produced over the course of 2 weeks with a level of care that suggested the project had been genuinely enjoyable. Louise taught Nora to keep books, to read surveys, to understand the legal structure of land ownership in the territory, which was knowledge that every woman in their situation needed, and which almost no one thought to teach them. Nora absorbed it with the focused appetite of someone who intended to use it. She was going to be formidable, her parents agreed privately, in whatever direction she chose to apply herself. In the summer of 1893, when Calvin was 43 and Louise was 38, and they had been married 9 years, they went together one morning to ride the southern fence line, just the two of them, as they sometimes did when the children were occupied and the work allowed a few hours of space. They rode side by side through the high summer grass with the sky enormous overhead, and the cattle dotted across the range in the distance, and the fence running straight and clean, the cedar posts weathered silver-gray now, the wire settled into the landscape as though it had always been there. They pulled up at the corner post, the same corner post where they had stood on that October morning 10 years before, when everything was still opposition and anger and the complicated precursor to what they had become. Louise looked at the post and then at the range beyond it. "Do you know," she said, "I was so angry that morning." "I know," Calvin said. "You had every right to be." "I was angry at you for months before I met you," she said. "I had built you into something very complete, very villainous." "You said," he said with the small smile that she loved most, the careful one that was more in his eyes than his mouth. "I was so ready to fight," she said, "and then you'd already moved the fence." "I was trying to be the person I wanted to be," he said, "rather than the person the situation was making it easy to be." She looked at him. 38 years old in the good October of a hard life, with 2 children and a stepdaughter and several hundred head of cattle and a great deal of work through sorrow and a great deal of hard-won joy, and she felt love for this man with the full clarity of knowing exactly what it had cost and what it was worth. "You asked me to stay for supper," she said. "You said you'd think about it," he said. "And then I showed up at your fence the next morning." "You did." The smile deepened. "I was very glad." She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand, and he held it in the way he had held it by the fire on Christmas night 9 years ago, with a warm and certain grip. The fence ran straight in both directions from where they sat. The grass was high and golden and moving in the summer wind, and the sky went on forever in every direction. And the cattle were fat on good range, and somewhere behind them across 7 miles of their combined land. Their children were alive and growing, and Nora was probably doing something impressive that she would tell them about at supper with the understated precision she used for achievements she was privately proud of. And James was probably doing something that required immediate parental attention, and Claire was probably sitting somewhere quiet, watching the world with those dark, considering eyes, organizing her observations about it. "Thank you," Louise said, "for moving the fence." "Thank you," Calvin said, "for coming to contest it." She laughed. The sound of it went out across the Oklahoma grassland, clear and uncontained as a bird in open sky, and the horses shifted under them, and the wind moved the high summer grass, and the fence line ran straight and true between 2 properties that were, in every practical and legal and meaningful sense, one life. They rode back toward the house in the late morning sunshine, riding close together, their horses easy and unhurried on the familiar ground, and the house came into view with its white paint, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney, and the sound, even from this distance, of their son's voice raised in what was either complaint or enthusiasm, and was probably both simultaneously. And Louise thought about all the fences in her life, the ones that had been wrong and then corrected, the ones she had built and defended, the ones that had turned out, when she examined them clearly, to be the very places where one good thing ended and another, better thing began. She rode through the gate of the Rourke ranch yard with her husband beside her and her life around her, and the October sky of 1893 overhead, and everything was fully and completely right. Clara appeared in the yard first, walking very purposefully from the direction of the barn with a tiny carved wooden horse in her hand, looking for her father with the determination of a 3-year-old who has made a decision about what she wants. She found him dismounting and held up the horse. "More," she said. Calvin crouched down to her level and examined the horse seriously. "More horses." "More," Clara confirmed. "I'll make you more," he said. "Tonight," Clara said. "Tonight," he agreed. Louise tied her mare at the post and watched her husband with their daughter in the October light and felt the whole of it, every part of it. The hard years and the grief and the anger and the petition and the fence and the hearing and the supper and the letters and the fire and the wedding and the children and the drought and the cold winters and the fat summers and all of it. Felt it as one continuous thing, one life, the life she had built and defended and opened and shared. And it was good. It was genuinely, completely, wholly good. James appeared from around the corner of the barn at a dead run and crashed into his father's side with the full force of a 4-year-old with no regard for his own structural integrity. And Calvin caught him with one arm while still holding Clara with the other and looked up over their heads at Louise with an expression of such complete and open happiness that she felt it land in her chest like a warm hand. "Come inside," she said. "Yes," he said. They went inside together, into the warm and the lamplight and the smell of the house they had made. And the door closed behind them on the October afternoon, and the fence ran straight on the southern boundary, and the land was good, and the life they had built on it was better than either of them had dared, in the difficult beginning of things, to hope for.